And
do I have a thing? Do I just press the button?
Wave. And as you might expect, as soon as you've heard of the Open Rights Group, this is to talk about privacy. So, big round of applause, thank you for Ruth.
I do feel a little bit weird after all these very practical demonstrations and tech things. I am mostly going to be talking about politics, so I don't have any explosions or anything to go with it. Yeah. So yeah, my name is Ruth. I'm the supporter officer at Open Rights Group, and those of you who haven't heard of us, we're a UK-based campaign group who work at the intersection between technology and human rights. So, for example, things like how does web censorship or web blocking affect our access to information? How does the right to edit videos of copyright works allow us to criticise corporations? How should access to genealogical records be open for everybody rather than for payment? Various quite broad different things. But one of the major things that we work on is the right to privacy and how that relates to the internet. And it's obviously been something we've worked on for quite a long time. We were previously very strongly campaigning on what's colloquially referred to as the Snoopers Charter, or the Communications Data Bill, which was a bill proposing the police have quite broad surveillance powers, allowing them to gather people's emails and phone records and that kind of thing. And we ran a big campaign on it for 2 years, and we won. It was lovely. It got removed from the Queen's speech, everything was good, and then 2 months later Edward Snowden happened. And we were like, everything we've been kind of saying shouldn't happen, turns out was already happening with NSA and GCHQ, who are the 2 major security agencies in America and in Britain. So that's what I'm going to be talking about. What exactly did we find out? What is it we don't like about it? And what are we going to do about it? So a lot of the information you might have heard about Edward Snowden is things about America and the NSA. A lot of the reporting is focused on what's happening over there. You'll have seen the comedy wiretapping eagle kind of floating around the internet. But we think what's happening at GCHQ with their kind of evil donut is just as bad. So the first leaks happened on 21st of June 2013, and one of the very first revelations that we had was that GCHQ were engaging in bulk collection of communications data by wiretapping fibre optic cables and storing communications data. And that's what we refer to as Tempora. That's what I'm going to focus on, although there were a lot of other leaks that came out at that time. So GCHQ has agreements with companies running international cables, and these cables going in and out of the UK and also at some overseas stations force companies to install equipment that duplicates all the information travelling through them and then sends the duplicate to GCHQ. They then store this data and they create what they call a time machine of the internet, which is really disappointing because it's not a time machine. And just means that they can recapture someone's history of the internet for a few days and kind of replay at slow speed everything someone did over a period of time. And that's why they call it a time machine, because they've just kind of kept that moment and then look at it again. And the amount of data they collect is about 21,000 terabytes a day. Anyone else handles that much data a day? Google. So kind of comparison of what they're doing. So what happens next? This information is then processed through a number of different filters. They discard everything they think has low intelligence value, like videos of armadillos and sleeping badgers, and chuck it out. And then they store everything they think is actually usable, like people's phone numbers, usernames, email addresses. And then they separate the content from what they refer to as the metadata, which they then keep for a further period of time. Metadata is kind of a key term in all of this. Whenever you hear politicians talking about mass surveillance, they'll always say it's just metadata. And they want to use that to assure that they're not reading anything of value. In fact, in a recent laws debate on data retention, which is a different story, our Lord said that nobody understands what metadata means, and if they did, they wouldn't be bothered. And I think that's kind of wrong and also patronising, because plenty of people do know what it means. But if you don't, it's basically the information that's the data around a communication. So communication is like a tweet or an email, and the content is what you actually said in the email, but the metadata is everything else, like who it was to, where did you send it, who it was from, like what operating system you were using, you know, all those other bits, which is actually quite a lot of information. So when they've got this, who's looking at it? There's a really strong link between American security agencies and spies and British security agencies and spies. In fact, they're so together, it's really hard to kind of separate out who's looking at what and like what programs are happening. But we do know that in America they have quite strict laws about not spying on their own citizens. They're definitely telling everyone that they are not spying on Americans. They're only spying on foreigners, which is us. And we are also aware that there are some restrictions in UK law about British spies spying on us, but we're not really sure that those laws apply to Americans and how much is being shared. We know there are a lot of NSA officials who also have access to this tempora data. And in the UK we have a much lower oversight regime anyway for accessing things. So the data sharing is pretty bad, basically. And then the Americans have a Linux-based system that they built called XKeyscore, which is kind of a search engine of personal information for people across the world. We're not freaking people out with all this stuff. And because that information is actually available to people in other countries as well. They call like the Five Eyes Alliance, and that includes Australia and Canada, and potentially Israel. We're not really sure, at least some of it maybe. And we've at least got figures that about 850,000 NSA employees and private contractors do have access to GCHQ databases. So that's basically what Tempora is. There are, like, as I said, many other leaks and various things we heard about. For instance, there was a story about GCHQ playtesting with facial recognition software by taking webcam chats from Yahoo, which they said they were surprised by how much sexual material they came across. I was surprised that Yahoo had a webcam service. But they targeted 1.8 million users to create a facial recognition tool. This wasn't even because people were under suspicion, they just wanted to see if they could build it, and they needed some faces. And for all we know, that data might also have been available to Americans. And then there are other things like weakening encryption, inserting backdoors. That's a whole load of other stuff. I did have, oh look, I've got a picture of Obama reading everyone's emails. We also have a wiki. If you go to wiki.openrightsgroup.org, we have a list of basically all the revelations with a little bit of information and links to the stories, and you can go through that. And we also do a weekly update where if there's been any more leaks of information, we send them out. So if you want to subscribe to that, you can do that. So yeah, those are the facts. And I want to talk about why we care and why I think other people should care. And I think the problem is often that people feel that it's separate because it's on the internet, because it's electronic. But kind of the whole point of Open Rights Group is that we believe that technology doesn't mean your rights don't apply anymore. They should be the same no matter what technology we invent. That's why they're universal human rights. And, you know, take the Yahoo example. If the government came into your house while you were sleeping or having sex and said, we're just taking photos of you, don't worry, we're not going to use them for anything, we're just going to experiment with them. Be a bit like, can you go away please? And as far as I'm concerned, it is the same thing. You should still have a right to privacy. And let's not forget that ultimately privacy is a law. This kind of spying is actually illegal, and it contravenes Article 8 of the European Convention on Human Rights, and Article 10, the right to freedom of expression. And the European Court has said that surveillance of this kind will never be compatible with the European Convention. We at Open Rights Group actually have a legal case at the European Court at the moment, but obviously we're taking the government to court, which is quite challenging, and we don't think that a European decision should be the answer. We think that Parliament should actually make actions themselves, especially as the government really doesn't like Europe at the moment. So there are many other issues that come out of this, that even if we take an acceptance that what's happening in the UK is okay because our governments are lovely and we completely trust them, there's a really bad international example that we're setting. For instance, in the Australian Parliament, a member of the Australian Parliament recently stood up and said that they should do the same kind of thing and have a greater allowance for data retention. And they said, look at Britain, and quote, this is the way that Western states are going. And the problem is that if Australia does it, then New Zealand does it, and if New Zealand does it, then Canada does it, and then, China and North Korea can really be like, everyone's doing it. We don't really have a leg to stand on when it comes to criticising other countries. There's also problems with poor oversight of this. There are a few kind of mechanisms set up that are supposed to scrutinise. But, for example, one of them is the Interception of Communications Commissioner. It's supposed to write an independent report every year about what's happening with surveillance, what warrants have been signed by the Home Secretary to give permission for this. But when he produces the report, it's mostly just a list of numbers. So, for instance, there were 2,760 warrants signed for interception in 2013. But that doesn't actually tell you what they were for, or how many people that covered, or under what law they were authorised. It's actually just a number. It's completely meaningless. There's also an Intelligence and Security Committee in Parliament who are meant to provide further oversight. But appointments to the committee are made by the Prime Minister. So again, it's not really an independent oversight. There's been no official confirmation that the Tempora program exists, but they have defended the practice of bulk data retention in theory. And they refer to this as the needle in the haystack argument. And they said, this is a line from GCHQ after the first Nova links. Essentially, we have a process that allows us to select a small number of needles in a haystack. We're not looking at every piece of straw. There are certain triggers that allow you to discard or not examine a lot of data, so we're just looking at needles. I'm sure you'll agree, makes everything very clear. You should see some of the other quotations that we had that were very long and just went on about needles and haystacks for quite a while. We have multiple haystacks and we're looking at different needles from separate haystacks. And what it's all about is like a giant farm, and they took the metaphor to quite a long point where we're just like, what are you even talking about now? Oh yeah, sorry, I'm just reading my face. They also have a couple of other counter-arguments. For instance, they say that if they do capture information that they're not supposed to, that's allowed as collateral damage to spying on terrorist suspects. And they also say that it's not so bad because their operatives generally forget everything they've looked at anyway. So that finally brings me to that finally brings me around to Don't Spy on Us, which is the talk title, and what we're doing. So in America, the Obama administration has at least made some protestations about spying on their own citizens, and there have been quite a lot of discussions. The Senate has talked about it, but in the UK, the government response has been something along the lines of, whilst we can't admit that we're watching you, you shouldn't mind if we are, and we can't tell you whether there's any oversight for these maybe existing programs, but we can tell you that there is any oversight, which may or may not exist, really good. And just get on with your lives now, please. So, the point of Open Rights Group is our lives is kind of talking about this stuff. So we're part of a coalition called Don't Spy on Us. It's made up of the influential organisations who work on privacy and free speech. That's Privacy International, English Pen, Open Rights Group, Big Brother Watch, Liberty, and Article 19. And there are lots of other kind of co-signed and supporting charities like Amnesty International, EFF, Public Concern at Work, Access Now. There's like lots of others who kind of like signed on and give us help. And we are basically campaigning that Parliament relook at the laws that allow surveillance and draft a new law that uses these 6 principles, which are kind of the bedrock of all the work that we do. These are the things that we think should be really clear about how the government use surveillance. So, number 1, no surveillance without suspicion. Basically, we do actually think it's appropriate that the police can track the activities of suspects, but they should have a reason. They shouldn't surveil everyone on the chance that someone is a criminal. They should use transparent laws, not secret laws. Again, that's the problem with the government not telling us which laws they're actually using to justify it. Laws should be open, that is the point of a democracy. There should be judicial, not political authorization. Warrants should be made by judges, not by the Home Secretary, which means that decisions are made impartially based on evidence rather than based on politics or expediency. There should be democratic oversight, as I've talked about before. Scrutiny bodies that check up on what security agencies are doing should be operating in the law, and they should be impartial. The right to redress, again, you should have a right to seek compensation or justice if these principles are broken. And a secure web for all. So, finally some technology in here. It may be dropped on the end, but this one's actually very important. As I said earlier, a lot of the leaks have talked about the NSA and GCHQ trying to crack encryption standards or to insert backdoors, and also to kind of get involved in internet standard settings and infiltrate groups who work on that kind of thing. And that kind of thing makes the web weaker for everybody. You know, banning locks just because criminals use them doesn't actually make sense for everybody else. It actually makes us all more susceptible to fraud and other kinds of online crime. So what we're doing at the moment is quite a few different things. We've got 2 different legal cases. We've got one at the European Parliament and one at what's called the Investigatory Powers Tribunal, which is a place which is kind of number 5. It's the closest we've got to that. We're also encouraging debates in Parliament. We organised a debate soon after the leaks came out. And we're doing things like this, talking to people about it. And we're running a petition and speaking to MPs and trying to make this an issue that comes up in manifestos. The Lib Dems did respond to a lot of the stuff and have made a digital rights manifesto in their kind of general manifesto. They've got a list of principles that they agree to. So what can you do? We want to make a massive petition ahead of the general 2015 election, and we want to make prospective MPs, candidates, and existing MPs really sit up and listen to this. So, you know, please sign the petition. It's at don'tspyonus.org. And also meet with your MP, talk to them about this, explain that it's important, tell them that they need to do a better job of scrutinising and holding the government to account. And tell them that the UK should set an example. You know, we used to be able to speak really strongly about human rights to the rest of the world, and now we're shying away from even using that word. So we need to kind of bring back a sense of pride in human rights and equality. So yeah, the address again is don'tspyonus.org. I hope this was interesting. Please let me know if you have any questions.
Do we have questions? We have questions.
It's a couple of requests and a question. I wondered whether it would be worth expanding on the example for that the EFF did for metadata. You aware of that slide they did of bad weekend? Because I don't know if people are aware of, that's a really good concrete example, I thought.
Yeah, I know the slide you mean, the one with if you were at Golden Gate Bridge.
Yeah,
the EFF had some other examples of things about how much metadata reveals. For example, if you were at Golden Gate Bridge and you called the Samaritans, you don't know what that call was about, but you can guess. If you called a sex hotline at somewhere other than your house, if you called your insurer just outside the doctor's, these are all kinds of examples where you only have where and who, but you can kind of guess the content, or you can get the content really, really wrong. Could be a call about something completely different, and they're still making an assumption because of the data that they're choosing to gather. Is that what you're thinking of?
Yeah, no, it's that example. And also with the kind of ability to track a browser, so it's the kind of metadata that they're collecting, the kind that people have talked about synthesizing to say, well, because you've got, I don't know, cookie X or cookie Y, it's this browser system, you're able to then synthesize, and
it's the same stuff that advertisers use to track you. And when you go to, I don't know, maybe you'll have much better ad blocking than me, but if I go to look at, it's noisy, right? I go and look at a shop, and then I go to a different website, and suddenly I've got an advert for those pair of shoes I was going to buy on a completely different site. It's a similar thing where, they can kind of track you and see all the different sites that you've been to, because they don't see web addresses as being content. That's also metadata.
Sorry, monopolised here. Is there any research been done on the effect of silencing? That basically, if you don't think that, I don't know, you've got something that you're campaigning on, or you've got a LBGT or something, you don't want people to be publicly aware of that. Is there any work been done on this being out there? Therefore, there's a.
Yeah, we've done some work with some women's rights group and women's shelters to talk about the kind of issues where you're trying to get away from, say, an abusive husband. We've done that largely, actually, about free speech and web blocking, which is a whole other area where people can't access the information. But we've been talking to them and kind of supporting them or talking about those issues, and probably going to do some training to help them teach people who are on the run how to better protect themselves online, that kind of thing. But you're right, we haven't done any kind of published document, it's been more like informal discussions with those kind of people.
Another question?
I think there's a certain amount of missing the point here. GCHQ and the NSA getting all the flack. You're missing out all the other countries as well who do it. But particularly, you're missing out on the fact, and it is a fact, that every single thing that ever goes on the internet will become public. It takes time, and GCHQ and the NSA and others probably speed it up a little bit. You mentioned yourself the number of private organisations that do exactly the same thing. There's also a huge number of criminals who do exactly the same thing as much as they can. And I think the problem with this sort of campaign is it's only talking to the people that you can talk to. So the only people who might ever listen are GCHQ and the NSA, etc. Whereas the great, huge swathe of other people doing exactly the same thing are being completely ignored. But they're probably much more of a threat.
I'm not quite sure you mean by other people. I will first of all say, two wrongs don't make a right. Just because other people are surveilling is definitely not because this is okay.
There's no talk about stopping them.
If you can establish the principle is law good enough for the government, then you can go after the others and say, this is what we believe as a country.
Yeah, I mean, what we have in the UK is the right to complain to our politicians. There's only, you can't really, speak to politicians in Australia and tell them what we think they shouldn't be doing. I mean, that is the job of Electronic Frontier Australia, for example. That's where we have the influence and the power. And we have talked about corporate surveillance, but obviously that's not part of this campaign. And it is also different because the significant thing is people do choose to join Facebook. There's a lot of stuff wrong with Facebook, definitely, but it is still a choice. People don't choose to be watched by GCHQ. And also, there's a very big difference between the government spying on the citizens. The point of government is to serve the people. Facebook's point is not to serve the people, to make money, or be a communication service. The government exists for the people, by the people, for the people. That's the whole thing. So we should hold them rightly to higher standards.
There are two other points there as well. Both GCHQ and NSA have got a dual mandate to spy on people and to secure cyber infrastructure. Now they're working both sides of that. They're sitting on 0 days and using them for themselves instead of fixing the 0 days that would keep the other guys that are spying on us, like the mafias and the Googles and whatever. They're sitting on those 0 days instead of fixing them.
They're inducing their own.
And the other thing is that they're backdooring services that, again, the mafias of this world can then use the Snowden revelations as a recipe book, as a set of techniques that they can learn, like man-in-the-middle attacks. So in actual fact, the NSA and the GCHQ have actually done the security of the greater community a great disservice as a byproduct, instead of actually having two separate organisations, one of which would have a mandate to make us as net citizens secure, and on the other hand, to do something about terrorism.
Yeah, I mean, I briefly mentioned the stuff about encryption, but I'm not an expert on encryption, so I didn't really want to go into too much detail on it. But yeah, there are obviously issues there too.
Another question in the back. Oh, I shouldn't have had all that pie.
Hi there. How is Open Rights Group funded?
A mixture of grants and donations, kind of 60-40 donations to grants currently. We have about 2,300 people who give us £5 to £10 a month that funds most of the staff, and then we also have 3 grants, one from Single Browsing Trusts, one from Open Society Foundations, and one from Joseph Rowntree Trust, who support a few of the staff projects, like open data research. A lot of our surveillance work is funded by JRT, because they do a lot of funding for political groups. I think Single Browsing also funds one of our staff's wages.
Any more questions? Oh, and relating the person closest.
Given that GCHQ and the NSA haven't always totally respected the law in the past, how important do you think it is to lobby for better laws in the future?
I think that's definitely why there's a mix of stuff in here, because it's also about having the right to redress, about oversight, about judicial, not political authorization. I think it's the combination of those different things that would make us more secure. If they break the law, there should be repercussions like there is for anyone else. That's the way the law works.
More questions? There were some other hands. Yes. Is that one for me, please?
Hello. I just wondered whether you'd done any work on surveillance by local authorities at all. In York, there's a proposal to provide free Wi-Fi across the city, linked to collection of data from people's smartphones and so on, where they enter shops and so on, and a suggestion that they're going to link it to advertising material and so on.
Yeah, we have actually. Quite a few other different kinds of surveillance. I'm pretty passionate about surveillance of job seekers, which is slightly different. That happens with the universal job match system, and I've given talks on that before. We've also done research and are starting to do work on workplace surveillance, and we've done some things about Wi-Fi systems in libraries with our local groups kind of working on that. And we've done a lot of like media work on those kind of things, like when journalists say, what do you think about this? We've done lots of talking on like local radio stations, that kind of thing.
Okay, there were some more hands I saw. Way across.
So, regarding a secure web for all, there are encryption technologies available now which can give you that now. I work in the internet security area, so I'm fully aware that a lot of people in the internet are not employed by NSA, and if anybody are developing crypto algorithms which can provide that now. And a question about the no surveillance without suspicion. So, I guess the assumption here is that there's this blanket surveillance because they trust nobody. So how do you think it's possible for an upstanding citizen to become above suspicion and therefore opt out of being subject to surveillance.
I think the principle is that we all should be outside of suspicion, place bugs on people who they already have suspicion, and there are plenty of other methods of finding out that people are suspects than like reading all their emails. You know, but the idea is innocent until proven guilty, and I think the same should apply with this kind of thing. You know, you then place people under surveillance after you've said this group of people, or you know, you can get warrants that after particular times and areas, the police have the right to say, we think this conference over here is very suspicious and we're going to surveil it for 3 hours on this date, but that's it. So that kind of thing already exists within the law.
Speaking of suspicious conferences, if anybody here is from the NSA or GCHQ, raise your hand. I'll just check. I think we've probably got time for one more question. If there's anybody who hasn't had questions?
Not quite sure how to ask this in a non-leading way. But, there's a lot in the news at the moment about Tor and the quote-unquote dark web. Do you think that's trying to imply criminalisation or some sort of anti-socialness of somebody that would use such a tool just to anonymise what they're doing?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the government is talking about making being anonymous on the internet illegal. There are, I mean, not like David Cameron, but there are definitely ministers who are proposing that and talking about that kind of thing. Certainly demonising using Tor because they want to place, you know, as few restrictions on their capabilities as possible. I think they're not going to win on making people anonymous because there are enough very sane people who can point out all the problems with that. But yeah, there are definitely ministers who say crazy things about the internet that are just completely wrong, or who think the internet is like a bedrock of evil and demons, and which they could only make, you know, maybe over 40 very sensible men who have signed like a license agreement to use the internet.
Which minister are you thinking of?
Thanks.
I can't remember, possibly Theresa May? I read a story very recently about suggesting making anonymisation illegal.
No, I mean she said that bit about only men over 40.
No, that was a joke.
And on that note, please, very